We're very happy to host this event. My name is Christopher Raiche. I'm the president, along with the lovely Darren Becker of the Harvard Buddhist Community. And this is an event sponsored by the Harvard Buddhist Community and the Buddhist Ministry Initiative, both of which are kind of designed at the Div School to look at the ways in which Buddhist practice can be bridged into social service, activism, and the larger culture as a transformative force. And along those lines, our two guests are very welcome to this mission, and we're very happy to have them. So I'll give a little brief bio and then let them do the talking. So Kittisaro, also known as Harry Randolph Weinberg, he hails from Tennessee, the USA. He graduated from Princeton as a Rhodes Scholar and went on to Oxford before going to Thailand and ordaining with Venerable Ajahn Chah in 1976. He was a monk for 15 years. And during that time, he helped form Chithurst, a monastery in Devan Vihara in the UK. He also taught extensively during this time and was involved in the training of monastics. He disrobed in 1991 and since then has taught internationally in the States, Europe, South Africa, and Israel. He has studied and practiced, as well as the Theravada teachings. He studied Chan and Pure Land for 35 years, informed by his master, Chan Master Hua. Kittisaro has completed 2 one-year-long silent self-retreats and is currently writing in between continuing his teaching engagements. And directly to his right, my left still, is Thanissara, who also goes by Linda Mary Peacock. She's from London, of Anglo-Irish descent. She started Buddhist practice in the Burmese Theravada school in 1975. She was inspired to ordain after meeting Ajahn Chah and spent 12 years as a Buddhist nun, where she was a founding member as well of Chithurst Monastery and Amavarti Buddhist Monastery in England. She was also co-initiator of events for children and families at Amavarti. Thanissara has facilitated meditation retreats internationally for the last 25 years and also holds Masters of Arts in mindfulness-based psychotherapy practices. She has written a book of poetry called Garden of the Midnight Rosary, and she is a co-facilitator of the Community Dharma Leadership Program at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. Kittisaro and Thanissara have been married since 1992. They spent 7 years as guiding teachers of the Buddhist Retreat Center, KwaZulu in South Africa, and then went on to found the Dharmagiri Hermitage on the border of Lesotho. They've been engaged in many various initiatives around AIDS and HIV prevention and treatment, and have a pronounced passion for climate change activism, and just came out with a new book titled Listening to the Heart, A Contemplative Journey to Engaged Buddhism. And we're very happy to have them here. They'll speak for a while, and a little bit before 7, we'll open it up for questions and answers. And they have their books here to be signed. And so let's all join in and warmly welcome our venerable guests. Thank you.
If I talk like this, can you hear? Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the warm welcome, Christopher, and on behalf of the meditation group here. My 98-year-old father just died about 2 months ago, and I'm sure he would be very pleased, as am I, just to even set foot on the Harvard Divinity School. Just the name, a divinity school, is something that intrigued me. The idea of a possibility, a hopefulness in the possibility, that there's a way to deepen into, to turn to touch the sacred, that is a pathway. And so I'm pleased to set foot here and to be welcomed. Though there was definitely some time in my life when I definitely didn't really expect to be so immersed and involved in so-called religious activity. My dad is New York Jewish, who came down south and married a Southern Baptist in the 40s. Back in the days when on some public places, some restaurants, it said, no blacks, no Jews. And yet they fell in love, and Dad wasn't keen to become a Baptist, and Mom wasn't contemplating converting to Judaism. But they both had a sense of this life being enriched by spiritual traditions. And so they finally found Mom saw a sign in a paper that said, a little snippet in it, "Are you a Unitarian and don't know it?" She said, "Mo, think we should go?" And they said, "Well, why not?" And so they went, and my dad ended up becoming a lay preacher, and so we were brought up to Unitarian sort of there meant the notion that we could learn from many different places, but there was some sort of unity, way that it all came together, some unifying mystery at the core. And I would have heard the name, of course, Christ and Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and Muhammad and Moses and the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And yet at school and for my clarinet lessons in the middle of the Bible belt, we were regularly told, you're going to hell, And so I just couldn't understand that. Inside this building that happened to say Unitarian, we were taught and tried to practice teaching, say, for example, of Jesus, and yet, you're going to hell. So in the early days, I just thought, religion was maybe for nutcases. And so I guess my religion was winning, wanting to, that somehow that one would be worthy if one really strove and to do good in sports. I wrestled in academics and ended up at, Mid-South Wrestling Champion, National Invitational Wrestling Champion, Rhodes Scholar, and was really thinking I'll get to happiness. And by the time I got to Oxford, I was 24, but felt 104, so weary, exhausted, and nothing was enough. And even though, especially if I was at home with all our trophies on the shelves or Mom's wonderful scrapbooks, and they were so supportive, and you'd see I'm this, I'm that, and feel, oh, maybe I'm okay, but close the book and there would be a real weariness. Nothing was enough. And then just hearing the word, or maybe first seeing it written, enlightenment, gave me the possibility that there was another way of looking, that we had this potentiality. And that started, I'd heard about a master in Thailand and where you could not just pick up the opinions of others, but discover, uncover, open to a treasure, a storehouse of understanding and capacity for resonance with our fellow living beings, with all that is around us, that's within us. And so that changed my life. There's a teaching in the Buddha that's called the Fire Sermon that says, everything is burning, everything. And what is this all that is burning? The Buddha would say, the eye is burning, and sights are burning, and the ear and sounds, and nose and tongue, tastes, the mind, and what we can think about, and feelings. It's all burning with the fire of just wanting, burning with the fire of hate, trying to get rid of, burning with the fire of delusion. And I had a sense for that when I came. I didn't know what to do about it, but this notion that you could keep consuming experience and finally arrive at happiness. And nothing was enough. And with this tyrannical mind that was always, worried about the next thing, I knew I was looking in the wrong place, not to deny the striving, the wanting to do things well, but looking in the wrong place. And when I was writing a thesis at Oxford on art, science, and mysticism in the works of Aldous Huxley, I wanted sincerely to understand how science and religion and creativity and how it worked together. But I wondered, why is nothing ever enough, and why, when we love beings and want to live together in harmony, do we end up fighting and harming each other? I just couldn't understand it. Wanted to figure it out. And when I first met this master, this Thai master Ajahn Chah that Christopher referred to, he first did something that sounds a bit crazy. He when he was asking me some questions about do I know how to meditate, I had done a 10-day retreat, so I thought I was pretty experienced. And when I was describing my meditation, he got down on the floor on all fours and started sniffing around all over the place like a dog and saying something in Thai which I couldn't understand, and everybody else that was there was laughing, and I was sensitive enough to know he wasn't impressed with my meditation. But when he finally got up and I got my friend to give me a translation, Ajahn Chah smiled, this warm smile, and just said, if you try to understand everything, give your attention to everything, you might not understand anything thoroughly. If you understand one thing well, you'll understand everything. And he said, why don't you learn how to be with your breathing? And even though that might sound a strange introduction, but even though people were laughing, the quality of the experience was touching. And for some reason, I ended up staying 15 years. But even now, to go back, when we're so much trying to figure out, like now, this burning, this fire, there's so much conflict on every level. Doubts and conflict in our own heart, this fire of trying to somehow find some ease, some happiness, some stability in a world that seems so shaking, polarized, not only in our psychology, but in the relational field, our communities. political world, the world, our environments actually, heating up, or at least leading to, climate change and more fierce and destructive storms. And in being encouraged to be with one thing well, to learn to be with the breath, not just intellectually. We all know, it's simple. If we were asked, is everything impermanent? Everybody would make 100 out of 100 on the test. Are trees permanent or impermanent? Impermanent. Is the day permanent or impermanent? Impermanent. Is my bank account permanent or impermanent? We all know. But it's one thing if that's known deeply in our experience. Our language has so many nouns in it that seem so solid, and when we understand our reality through the prism of language, not questioning the grammar, not questioning the syntax, it imputes a solidity, a stability that is not really there, like me, mine, good, bad. And in training, this first engagement, though it might sound like running away, the first engagement in a path of healing and transformation is to cultivate primary relationship with this body, these sensations, this moment, and being with an in-breath and an out-breath. Sounds like a thing, but one then notices, experiencing that every moment the vibration, the swelling of the breath shifts and changes, dissolves back into the out-breath. And it's the same is true for energy, for feeling, for even right now, this talk in the Harvard Divinity School on March 23rd, Kittisaro might have the idea of an event. Yet if we touch this experience with the humble investigation of a childlike mind that doesn't hold on to preconceived notions, we'll see this experience is a tapestry of sight mixed with sounds that touch consciousness and dissolve. Sensations of our body, some pleasant, some unpleasant, maybe some reactions to, where's he going with this talk? Not so sure. That it's actually shifting and changing, and that the so-called talk, the experience, is actually something that's arising and ceasing within a context, a matrix of listening. That actually all this experience is happening within a field of presence. Every sound that comes and goes back into the silence is not a dead silence, but a listening, awake silence. Our body sitting in the chair appears within this knowing silence. That actually all the, through language at least, complexity, particularity of here and there and good and bad and friend and foe and my right way, the Buddhist way or the Christian way or the Jewish way or the Muslim way or the atheist way or the I'm a confused, don't know what way I'm waiting on, or all the particularity of this moment is arising and ceasing, merging back into this listening awareness. The Buddha was once asked by a great refined being, what's called a deva, a kind of king of the gods type being. This being This is recorded in one of the discourses in the Digha Nikaya. This being asked the Buddha, beings wishing to live without hate, harming, hostility, or enmity. They wish to live in peace, but beings live in hate, harming one another, hostile, and as enemies. Why? Why do beings that want ease, want happiness, why do we end up living like this? And certainly this could be a true statement about so much of the fires of conflict in the world now. And the questioner, Saka, went on and said, what fetters are there? What qualities of heart bind beings so that they live in such a way, in enmity and hostility, as enemies? And the Buddha, the first quality said that lead to this conflict is envy and stinginess. This quality of mind that puts out there, oh, that's where the good stuff is, what they've got. And stinginess, the idea of something we have, me, mine, that I don't want to lose, got to keep it. This split, this concretization, objectification of me, mine, they, theirs. Then Saka said, but what leads to envy and stinginess? And the Buddha talked about the different qualities that little by little by little lead to envy and stinginess. First, it's even making the distinction, liking and not liking. Oh, I really like this. This is good. Don't like that. Keep away from that. Then the Buddha talked about desire leading to that. And then thinking. That when there's thinking, then one starts making these distinctions. But it's not just any kind of thinking. The root cause of all this conflict, even though living beings wish to live in harmony, end up living in hostility. The root cause is what the Buddha called papancha sanya sankha. It's perceptions, thoughts that are tinged with this delusion that makes them multiply and proliferate, forming complexity. Like this smallest, simplest thought that seems so obvious, I. Taking this tapestry, this current, this cascading sensations of this moment and interpreting it as, no, it's I experiencing this. You get an I, then you have a you. As soon as there's a here, there's a there. Yesterday, tomorrow, this complexity. And with the attention, the nature of mind assumes these objects, these sights, these sounds, these forms as me and mine. Then we're what the Buddha calls, and the great saints and sages call, looking for certainty in that which is not certain. Because whatever we take, even my wrestling 5-time Mid-South champion, me, mine, how long does your hand stay up in victory? Within 5 minutes of the awards ceremony, I was already worried about who do I fight next year to defend my title. And then not long of that, in my first 2 years as a monk in Thailand, I got typhoid fever and then hit by some internal bleeding kind of thing where I had to lie down for 3 years. I was really sick for 10. Where's my strength? What we take to be me, mine, keeps eluding us. Rooted in this misunderstanding. And so this first part of turning in to really engage the fundamental elements, the primary elements of our life. The body, the feelings, and seeing for ourselves this changing nature. And little by little realizing that all this so-called change arises and ceases back in this background, this presence, this place where all things merge. Once we really start to harmonize with the way things are, we start sensing that just like the trees, the magnificent oak, the noble evergreens, the delicate and beautiful silver birches, the beeches, we might have preferences like this over that, but if we look more closely, we realize they merge in the ground. You can't separate the tree from the ground. Every branch falls back into the ground, that there's a deep kinship. And so too, when the heart turns back to the source, it starts touching into this ground of being. What the Buddha called our original brightness, where then we will sense our kinship with our fellow beings. And we'll see through this unfeeling objectification, this apartheid of the heart and mind that puts out of the heart, oh, the people that are not the right color, not the right class, not the right view, not the right party, not the right nationality, that can so objectify our life to make us think that we own this earth and can make a profit out of it, and without even needing to sense into what is the consequence. Not noticing, because we're so into me and mine, what I want, that this so-called me is not really separate. That for me to be sustained, I need to continually breathe in a quality of vitality. Breathe in what the trees breathe out. What I breathe out, the trees breathe in. That we are actually a part of a web of life with forms and plants and trees and animals, consciousness. So actually we're orphans and refugees from our own source. And all what is so wonderful about, at least the spirit, from what I can gather of this Harvard Divinity School, is I saw on your, I love the first phrase on the website, exploring all religions. In a sense, honoring, while aligned with none. Not saying this is the one. My Chinese master says, you know which religion is the best? So you're all predicting he's going to say Buddhism. He said, you know which religion is the best? The one you practice. And if we practice our religion, our spiritual path, sincerely, and I believe really listening to the insight of the saints, we will first touch into this true nature of the moment. See things changing. Realize that what is essentially changing can't be claimed, and give it back. What is not really mine to Mother Nature, to Dharma, and touch back into that place where we all merge, all come together. I love the way that the different religions merge, even in the Christian teachings. I love this idea, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, but the Ihidaya, or Ihidaya, some Aramaic words that's talking about the Christ as the one that is single, not split, not cut off, but unified, fully human. The good, he said, has come among you to reunite everything back to its origin. When we, in our own moments, bring things back to this origin of our presence, then there's the possibility as we widen from that place of standing in the ground of how it is to include our community, our world, our challenges. And I think rather than just being guided by views and opinions, they will be blessed by something that is connected to the sacred. I'll finish with, before turning over to Thanissara, with a short quote from the Buddha about this unifying principle. He said, "The primary misconception about the body and mind is the false view that the mind dwells in the physical body. You do not know," he says, "that the physical body, as well as the mountains, the rivers, empty space, and the great earth, are all within the wonderful, bright, true mind." So may we all touch into this bright, true mind where we will remember, as opposed to dismember, our true kinship with all things. So thank you for your attention. And now I'm going to turn over to Thanissara.
Greetings, everyone, brothers and sisters, venerable bhikkhus. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Gaya, together with 1,000 bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, all is burning, and what is the all that is burning? The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning, eye contact is burning. The ear is burning, sounds are burning, the nose is burning, odors are burning, the tongue is burning, flavors are burning, the body is burning, tangibles are burning. The mind is burning, ideas are burning, mind consciousness is burning, mind contact is burning. Also, whatever is felt as pleasant or painful or neither painful nor pleasant, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. I say it is burning with birth, aging, and death, burning with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. So said the Buddha. It's my commentary. Just know the feeling in the feeling. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? Buddho, attend with each heartbeat. Bud, with the in-breath. Dho, with the out-breath. Direct mindful awareness to feeling. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? It is unpleasant. Consuming fire of outrage shoots searing sensations into our flesh core. Frozen grief at deceitful ruin aches every living cell. Weighted stones of dreaded despair pull the heart down through each vertebrae into softening tissue and oxygenated blood pumping pain. Chemical dissonance surges into brain coordination and scrambles sanity. Trauma releases into the world. The beast has no holding. It roams and scavenges the desecrated, rotting flesh of grandiose structures that peel away from our faded, fast, capitalist gods who abandon us all in the end. Here, enlightenment lands like a sick thump to the stomach. At night, we track mala beads along the wild stations of our heart, so we can know the lost islands of our soul, like animals at a dry waterhole. So I want to really address the issue of the times we're living in and how the Dharma can help respond, bring us into authentic and engaged response to a world in crisis on so many levels. First of all, to be able to know that we need to engage and respond, we have to know what we're in relationship with, the realities of what is actually happening. There was a time in the journey of the Buddha's life when he was Siddhartha Gautama, before he became the awakened Buddha, when he left the palace of his comfort zone, if you remember the story, and went outside to roam around and have a look at what he hadn't really come into contact before. He'd been protected, lived an entitled life, wealthy life, had all the things that he wanted, and hadn't really thought that deeply about things, just assumed things would carry on just the way they had been forever. And as he roamed around in the marketplace beyond the walls that he had been so much protected within, he saw what's called the Devadutas, the heavenly messengers that had been shielded from him. And as we know in the story, the first 3 heavenly messengers were the recognition or the coming across someone, first of all, that was aged and decrepit. And he was young and beautiful and handsome and youthful, but he saw this aged body and he was disgusted. He wanted to turn away, but lingered a little bit longer and saw that it wasn't very beautiful to age. And then, as we know in the story, he came across someone that was profoundly sick, throwing up in the gutter, just gross. And he looked at this person and felt very disaffected. And again, wanted to turn away, but just lingered enough to be there, to allow the impression of that sight to enter more fully into his body, into his being. And then one of the last, he saw 4 signs. The third one was that he saw a corpse, a dead body, lifeless, like a log, rotting in the side of the road. And when he saw that, he felt shock, felt horror, and thought, does this too happen to this body? And at that moment, when he was impacted so profoundly by these Devadutas, it said that he exclaimed in shock, the vanity of youth has left me. The vanity of long and lasting life has left me, because I too am subject to these things. This body is subject to this inevitable decay. And it was this sight, really, these sights, these 3 Devadutas, and then the 4th one, which we'll come to in a moment, that really spurred the Buddha on from living in a sort of dreamlike life, hanging out, enjoying the comforts, and just thinking things would go on like they had forever. They initiated him into the profound process of awakening. It wasn't this heavenly messengers, it wasn't something from the heavens that was uplifting and divine and beautiful and full of light. It was actually a confrontation with the most difficult and degrading experiences. But it was a purpose. The purpose was to begin to awaken, the journey of awakening, the journey of exploration. In a certain way, the Buddha's life is so much a metaphor for so many parts of our unfolding and our awakening, not only personally, and we tend to think of the Buddhist path often in quite personal terms, especially in the contemporary translation of Buddhism into Western cultures. It's a lot about me and my enlightenment path. And this is often how the struggle of my process and my awakening. We don't tend to think of it in a more collective way, but what we actually are being challenged by, in the same way that the Buddha was challenged, is that we're opening our eyes not to this human body, this body, my body, but we're opening our eyes to the earth body and being collectively challenged at such a profound level to have to understand that this earth is sick. Many of its ecosystems are dying. It's under threat, and already it is producing many corpses in the endless extinction of species, in the endless decimation of communities through extreme weather events that are becoming more frequently reported. In the understanding of each piece of news, as we come to see that the oceans that are so beloved and so essential for our abilities for sustainable life on Earth are becoming warmed and becoming acidified and becoming denuded from fish, as we see the forests being razed, as we see the water systems, aquifers drying up, as we see all of the various ecosystems that we've come to know and rely on changing at a very rapid pace. For example, the ice caps now melting in terrifying ways. And all of this, as we continue, is we're waking up to realizing, in the same way that the Buddha woke up, to realizing the outcome of how we have lived, that we cannot escape having taken birth, having gone through more naive passages of life, romanticized passages of life. We have to awaken into something more realistic, and in the same way to wake up to our lifestyles that have been so kind of in a dream, that we are, as Kittisaro was saying, that somehow these lifestyles have been based on the assumption that we are divorced from Mother Nature, that we can control the natural environment, and that we own, more than control, but it's ours to own and to exploit and to plunder, except that now we understand we would need 6 planets, at least, for us all to live the kinds of lifestyles we would aspire to. There's not enough resources left. So it's a very, very shocking awakening to understand that as we are pushing huge amounts of nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, methane into the atmosphere, that there is just increasing the heat of the biosphere. So the amount of heat that is being released is equivalent, say, of 1 Hiroshima bomb a second, and it's probably even more now, that we have gone past, as we know, the more stable climate of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide to oxygen in the atmosphere is now touching into 400. The temperature is rising to dangerous levels, all as the result of our ways of living. Not always from being propelled by the force of greed, hatred, and delusion, though some of it is, but also just in our more naive relationship to the reality of interdependence, that we think that there are not consequences. So now we see the results, the typhoons, the big winter northeast of this country that you've just had, the precipitation as the earth dries and more moisture goes into the atmosphere, creates more unpredictable storms, of more extreme weathers, flooding and storms, snowstorms. Typhoon Haiyan, for example, which displaced many thousands of people, killed many thousands of people, actually displaced millions of people. Pakistan, a few years before, displaced 20 million people. Syria, a few years before Syria exploded in its civil war, about 60% of its fertile land dried up, 80% of its cattle died. It's not viable. The Syrian Minister of Agriculture said, this is beyond our capacity as a country to deal with. The peasants rose up, they walked on the capital, Damascus, seeking solutions, and other configurations, political and so on, all combined to spark the most atrocious and horrific implosion of violence and war. But underneath, many of the wars that we're increasingly seeing are the struggle for resources and survival. Underneath the increased migrations from Africa to Europe and so on is the diminishing resources and viability of lifestyles in countries and in situations where the climate is changing. And in many ways we thought this is all happening over there. Like we throw rubbish or garbage away and it's like over there somewhere, it goes over there. Until we have a Pacific garbage patch the size or even bigger than Hawaii and 5 kilometers deep. There's no over there. This realization of the one heart also means there's no over there for our garbage. It's all, we merge in the intimacy of the awakened listening heart, but you also merge in the intimacy of the shock therapy of waking into, not into heavenly idealizations of nirvana, but into the realities of a nightmare. Leaving dream thinking far behind, we arrive and awaken into what is very difficult to be with. Even it's not over there, as we see now in California, with incredible droughts, predictions of terrifying predictions of rapidly decreasing water supply in a state that supplies, that's the 5th largest producer of food in the world, the 7th largest economy in the world, and produces, I can't remember the percentage, but a very large percentage of food here in America. So this is the first noble truth. This is dukkha that the Buddha talked to, but not so much on the personal level of the experience of my own personal suffering. This is a dukkha that we're increasingly experiencing together collectively as a planet, as different countries, and that reveals the interconnection of all things, the truth of the Dharma, that things are not over there, things are not separate. As countries and as peoples, our fates are deeply entwined. So while, for Buddhists, while we practice for our own cultivation, our own ethical growth, our own cultivation of samadhi, our own wisdom, our own insight, our own liberation, maybe we translate that into living as a sort of low impact, having a minimal footprint kind of person, which is good, but it's not going to be enough. It's not worthy of enough of a response from the example of the Buddha for actually what we're facing, the extraordinary challenges that we're now facing, because these are challenges at a systemic level. It's not so much about me personally anymore and my path. That we have generated a biosphere that is driving us perilously close to the possible collapse of our civilization and a viable life on earth. This is not just some fear-mongering. This is science. This is what we've been looking at now for several years. It's just really being confronted by this larger level of dukkha, which has its causes. So, to begin to explore, as we know, as the heart of the Buddha's teaching is to actually come to terms with dukkha, to meet it, so that we can overcome it. The first step is to really be willing to inform ourselves, to open to the realities that we now live in, to change out of this, snap out of this dream that we're in, of our personal redemption and our personal journey, that we're not actually able, that's a luxury maybe, to live in that way without being impacted. We are going to be impacted. We are already impacted. How this due to these collective causes and results by the way that we have been living. So first of all, the causes, to look from this othering. Sarah mentioned at the very subtlest level is the way that we even perceive, the way that we think, the way that the mind, the mano-vijnana aspect, the consciousness that goes out and designates and names, because there's a name for something, we think of it as other than us, creates separation, it creates difference. So to begin to shift, even at that subtle level, our way of contemplating and being and thinking that that stops splitting the world and ourselves, and creating these false dichotomies, and beginning to understand the interconnection, interdependence, the co-arising nature of everything. Beginning to look at shift from the models of consumerism, as Kittisaro said, this patinissagas taught by the Buddha, which is a very beautiful term which means to give back. It appears in the Anapanasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing, that at a certain point the release, the recognition of allowing things to, or as Ajahn Chah, a teacher, would say, to let go of the boulders of the mind, to let go, to not be here on the earth just about what we can get, but also about what do we need to let go of, to let be. So to learn to shift from a consumer I hate that word, I've always hated that word, to be designated as human beings as consumers. To shift out of that whole idea of consuming and using the earth for endless sort of profiteering. To look more sustainably, how can we shift from that model to models of more inner sustainable lifestyles. So this is a practice of inner and collective simplicity where we learn to find a sense of inner well-being that's not just dependent on what we gather and what we collect, but the quality of our lives, the quality of our ability to cultivate and nurture community together. There's generally 3 levels of responses. So it's in the third noble truth. In the second noble truth, there is the looking at the causes. And in the third noble truth, really relates to the 4th heavenly messenger that the Buddha saw in that morning when he was walking out into the marketplace. He'd seen 3 signs that had shocked him awake and initiated his awakening journey. And then on the 4th person that he saw was someone in robes, a samana, as we know the story, very peaceful, just walking through life, but actually taking a very different road than the way of the world, a radically different road. And it symbolized a radical path, a different way. And for us, it's a very important symbol because it is a path of possibility. It represents a path of peace, a path of awakening, a path of service, a path of compassion, a path of insight and wisdom, clarity, discernment. That this is also within our human potential. We're not just here as consumers, to keep progressing into some endless trajectory without taking into account the viability of the resources that we're working with. So in this new path to the first thing that we need to do as a society, and each of us individually to at least open to and to consider, is to keep the carbon emissions and the fossil fuels related to them in the ground, to actually work towards doing that. I don't know how we're exactly going to do it on such a massive scale, but there are possibilities, there are other ways of being, are other models of energy. By withdrawing, putting political pressure to ask governments to withdraw their subsidies from fossil fuels so it becomes a level playing field for renewable energy. To divest, as I know it's a very big issue here in the student body in Harvard at the moment, to divest big institutions, churches, and so on, to take out their capital from those sorts of companies that are acting in extremely heedless and dangerous ways in regard to the earth, to stop immediately the extreme methods of extractions like fracking and Arctic drilling of fossil fuels, blowing off mountaintops and so on in the Appalachia. The second thing we need to look at is to sequester the current carbon already in the atmosphere that's dangerously heating the planet, to put pressure on political bodies to bring about carbon tax, to protect and plant forests, that will protect those existing and plant forests, to encourage crops like hemp, which can replace plastics and also help to absorb unnecessary, the overload of carbon. And then the third area that we can actually proactively explore is to invest in renewable energies on the scale of what happened in the Industrial Revolution, by putting political pressure, by asking for increased government subsidies, almost by asking for and putting pressure into something like a Marshall Plan for this earth. And in some ways, that's this shift into renewables is happening in so many interesting and hopeful ways. In 2010, the global investment in renewables exceeded those of fossil fuels. And that trajectory is, if allowed to have more of a level playing field, that trajectory would increase exponentially. And you see countries like Costa Rica that have become 100% renewable since December, 75 days. A town in Texas, Georgetown, there's a number of 54,000 people are committed to going 100% renewable in the next 2 years. In France, they're creating initiatives to help to ensure that roofs become covered with solar PV systems and plants. In Australia, they're using ocean wave motion to generate zero emissions and to desalinate the water. And in Portland, generating electricity from turbines installed in city water pipes. And so there's a lot of really kind of creative, interesting things happening. I've just been in South Africa, where the national grid there, Eskom, has been is fired mostly through nuclear power, coal-based power. Tremendous. It's actually unnecessary in many ways because there's such an incredible amount of solar available, obviously, in Southern Africa. And but the way that the grid is actually, in many ways, for a number of reasons, is not managing the demand for electricity. So every day there are blackouts. They call it load shedding there. And this is actually just interesting alliances that can start to happen across communities around the issue of sustainability. I went to a meeting with 60 farmers, big farmers. This is a part of rural area that's pretty still somewhat caught up in racism and the effect from apartheid. Not my natural allies, but making contact and actually exploring together and inviting people to come to talk about renewables and beginning to think as a community, how might this might look, because that's the level of engagement needed. So when it comes to Buddhism and what can its part, what part can it play in a response for a world on fire, beyond and including this inner work of transformation, but also beyond just our personal journeys of awakening. There is many examples from the Buddha's life himself which we can draw on, radical examples of how he didn't just decide. As we know, on the night of his awakening, when he really considered it and considered trying to communicate the subtle insight that he awakened to, he really felt this is too difficult to communicate. Which is anyone that teaches the Dharma knows it's actually quite difficult to communicate some of these subtle insights. And he was on the verge of just sort of like, well, goodbye sweet world, and go off to the Himalayas and let people get on with it. Won't even try. When it said another great deva appeared from the Brahma realms, Hermitage, and came before the Buddha and said, out of compassion there are those with a little dust in their eye, and for want of you not going forth to turn the wheel of the Dharma, they will not have the opportunity to hear this teaching and to remove the suffering. So there's a compassion. This is for them for 40 odd years, teaching from the motivation of compassion. And we see the Buddha not only teaching to internal shifts of consciousness, awakening, enlightening people, but he also took on, in a very dramatic way, the structures at a systemic level of his time by, for example, promoting social justice and equity and diminishing discrimination through his ordinations, not only of priestly caste, the Brahmins who kind of controlled that whole territory, but also the ordination of all castes and women and slaves. And as they entered his Sangha, they dropped their caste identity, their hierarchical privileges, and instead were considered all equal in the way of awakening. So this was he was challenged at a very root level and shook the foundations of a society, and was highly critiqued and vilified. He tried to stop wars. He didn't just say, oh, well, things are impermanent. He actually actively went out and tried to negotiate with people, help them negotiate, help step them down from violence. He advised kings and generals, got involved in politics in that way, and tried to give wise, compassionate advice, ethical advice. He taught against animal sacrifice, compassion for animals, against enslavements of peoples. He went even when his own tribe, the Sakyan clan, were under threat from a neighboring king called Widudaba, who had been. It's a bit of a backstory, but anyway, this king marched on Kapilavastu with the intention to kill all of the inhabitants there, because he'd been slighted by the peoples he felt of that community, and that happened to be the Buddhist community actually. And it's said that for 3 times he tried to stop this happening. He went to the gates, tried to talk them down, tried to turn it around, but he couldn't. The karma was such that the violence was such, the aggression, that his people were decimated. But it's also said, what's important to see in this example is that he tried. He didn't go, oh God, that's human beings, let me just go off and sit on my zafu. He actually went out and made an effort. So here we see in many ways that he spoke out, made proclamations, challenged, used his intellect, used every resource he had within him to try and promote a more compassionate and wise world, even while understanding that however much you do that, the world is also fraught with ignorance. So he also taught the inner practices of equanimity and relinquishment. One balanced the other. So as we consider the times we're in, it's very important that we consider how we could maybe think about the Dharma and Buddhism as something that has a lot to offer into a world in crisis, and that for the want of speaking out, like Saka said to the Buddha, for the want of speaking out, people wouldn't get to hear, they wouldn't get the possibility of working more proactively and wisely with suffering. In the same way, to actually respond to the crisis we're in, then it does require our willingness to speak out, to inform ourselves, to educate ourselves, to begin to look at ways to help promote a more sustainable, holistic, and viable society. So it looks like that's enough for now. So
I want to just leave a little bit of time if people want to do a little back and forth.
Sure. Yeah.
Q&A.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. So anybody who would like to share anything that arose or ask questions of either speaker, this mic is portable and I can bring it to you And if you raise your hand, I can ask a question. There seems to be one kind of stumbling block in a lot of Buddhist communities I perceive. There's this desire to always maintain some kind of composure, and to get upset is seen as a fault, is seen as a failing of practice, like you're not equanimous enough. And how, you're trying to lean into some very uncomfortable territory that most of us have a lot of aversion to. And if you have any advice on how to work with that, but not have working with that become this perpetual navel-gazing, privileged, I'm going to go back to my zafu and work with how anxious I am about the state of the world, but still have energy to lean forward and move into the necessary fights.
I think it's important to be in touch with the natural devastating feelings that arise when we really open ourselves to the realities of our collective experience now. And some of that will involve despair, overwhelm, rage, anger, disbelief, denial, the whole gamut and whole range of feelings. To be able to within the feeling of anger, I mean, the Buddha taught it's not functional or advisable, just dwell heedlessly in the energy of anger. It burns you up, and it's not the most functional way to operate from that energy, and you tend to create a sense of other and rage against, the endless othering. So there's an inner work that has to be done, but also to deny that energy is to lose the possible to transform that energy into strength and power, clarity, because within anger, if you actually listen into it, it actually has always some maybe wisdom there too. It's not just it's saying something, your boundaries have been violated. If you look at it psychologically, it's often to do with the violation of boundaries, or there's something unhealthy that's happened, and the natural system, just at a system level at the bodily level of the body, then the natural energy in response is anger. So it's a question really not of the energy, but how do you use it, how do you distill it, and then how can you direct that in a clear and positive way. And it is a mistake to act out of anger, there's no doubt, but it doesn't mean to say that you should then prematurely repress those energies, and you tend not to then get into full touch with the full authenticity of an appropriate response.
I think the energy of the skillful standing up against something that's wrong and unjust, we little by little purify that through just trying. I mean, in the monastery, someone raises an eyebrow, that's almost like a violent act. And, here we'd been 15 years in a monastery, and then we found ourselves in KwaZulu-Natal. And, we had... the name of our hermitage is Dharmagiri, Sacred Mountain, but you might call it Dharmagiri. I mean, there was just always something going on. I remember when we arrived, there was a big trench on the land, and that the neighbor had, it turned out, tried to kind of triple his water supply by boring into ours and hoping he would cover it up before I would get there, and figuring I wouldn't know. And so I was, being nice and calm about it and thinking about it. And then when I looked up and saw the deeds and this and that and realized what it was, in the middle of the night, this big no came up. So I went and told the guy, this is, not acceptable. He says, Harry, you're angry. And I said, that is correct. And but it was a way of just learning how to say, that is not the way to treat neighbors, just to try to deceive and to trick. And I remember early on when this young Zulu lad that was, they were refugees, at least they told us that, from political violence somewhere else, and he came up shaking. saying the guy next door was trying to kill him. And so, I must say, I didn't want to go next door, but I knew that's what I had to do. But so I needed to use a mantra because my heart was beating faster to try to remind myself to just listen at ease to these inner and outer sounds. And I said, Thanissara, I have to go next door. And she says, I can't let you go next door. You might get killed. I said, well, I got to go. And she said, well, I'm coming too. So we walked next door, and this older Zulu man, he was in a fury. But my Zulu wasn't so good. His English wasn't so good. But, I just said, you don't go over there. He doesn't come over here. And tomorrow, kusasa in Zulu, I said, we're going to have a conversation. So I took them to the police station the next day to have this Zulu sergeant with a big scar down his face. Got them to talk to one another about what had happened. And he ended up getting them laughing, and, finally they shook hands. And, in 20 years, one didn't kill the other. That's something. And, in little ways, just to try the best we can. And maybe it's not so pretty, but if we have a practice of returning to the moment and listening into our intention, I think little by little we can, as Thanissara was saying, take this wisdom in sometimes anger is telling us there should be a boundary here, that's not acceptable, to really think again, to look at that energy can little by little become more effective. Maybe.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I kind of have two questions. The first is, we often hear, it isn't about goals. It isn't, the Enlightenment isn't going to fix all your problems, right? And you guys, I think, both spoke to that. Yet there are problems, and there are people that, that are not Buddhists and have no interest in learning to be Buddhists or see the world in that way. And as you say, this is a global problem, and not something that can be done by just people willing to listen to the Buddhist words and ideas. So how do you convince people that it's worth trying, that it's worth, even though you may not, it looks like it's impossible that it's going to be solved, but it's worth, giving that try? And I guess maybe it is just a single question, because the other question I had was, there are people that are clearly completely opposed to facing the reality, the science. And how do you include them too? Without saying, well, those other people that have the wrong view, as you said, that's one of the categories we put. Yeah. So.
What was the first bit about? I think they're very good questions, and it's difficult, just to be realistic that there are huge forces that are ignorant and in denial within us as well, but very, very powerfully so at very powerful levels. Corporate level, at people with huge amounts of wealth that are sort of hijacking democratic processes, and there is a force that you'd be naive to think that was just going to sort of roll over in a very loving way, sort of start spreading metta. That's not going to happen. So I think one has to be realistic, but it doesn't mean to say, like the night of the Buddha's awakening, every force possible aligned against him to undermine, sabotage. Who do you think you are? You can't do anything, and you should be doing your duties, and you're nobody. And so then what he did is he touched the earth as a witness. This earth has been a witness to all my many lives, to all my many endeavors. And called the earth to bear support for this final moment of awakening. And I think we have to find resources. I think one has to just keep working in the way that we do to respond and to talk about and to do whatever we can and to join forces, or not only with Buddhists, but I've been quite involved with faith groups. There has to be a collective response beyond Buddhist sectarianism, beyond faith sectarianism. If you look at any successful change movement, whether it's civil rights or anti-apartheid or Satyagraha in India or the Solidarity in Poland, they had, the reason often they were so successful is they had a lot of faith-based energy within them. So this is something that we can bring with other peoples of faith to the movement of sanity. And so you look at the People's Climate March that happened in New York. There were about 15,000 people of faith that gathered just for that march. And it was just a very powerful statement, and there's dialogues going on from that. So one has to look outside of one's box, and then just keep. And I think, as you know, we lived for 10 years through denial in South Africa about AIDS at government level. I mean, it was like madness, institutional madness, and people were dying of AIDS. Ministers, even as they were saying there are no AIDS. And people were being killed for saying that they were HIV, and it was just there had to be the continual battle on a legalistic level, taking government to court, taking pharmaceuticals to court, to bring about a compassionate and humane response to this. So in a way, having lived through a madness of denial, I actually think the more crazy denial gets, the more you begin to, it's actually a sort of almost a hair-bringer of radical change. And I think that's happening with the climate thing. It's like the denial's getting more and more absurd, like in Florida, don't mention the word climate change. I mean, how absurd is that? It's like the ground for that kind of voice is lessening. And I've seen an exponential shift of awareness. I mean, even the taxi when we came from IMS, the guy, a regular guy, I guess you'd say, a taxi driver, and started talking about climate change, It's a conversation that probably wouldn't have happened a year or so ago without you feeling like you were a bit weird, but very naturally. So I think there's a real growing awareness, and people are beginning to maybe thaw out of the initial shock and denial. And also, as there's hopeful innovations happening, and one also needs to always talk about the hopeful, not only the disasters.
I think we might have time for one more question. We also want to leave a little bit of time for book signings, and their most recent book is about the interface between practice and social action. Would you like to ask? Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm not sure how formally formulated this question is. Last spring we had Ajahn Thanasanti come, and we had a film screening of the Buddhist Forgotten Nuns, and she's been very outspoken about the marginalization that she experienced in the monastic community. And I'm not sure how much you'd like to share about your own experiences, but it brings up a question for me about how relevant monastic communities are, and some of the solitary and small communities in California are struggling to get by, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about the future of monastic communities in the West particularly.
Thank you for that. It's a big subject. So I've sort of, I think Buddhism per se in its traditional forms is something of a crisis. It has to, it's always a very conservative movement, and yet it has this radical founder in many ways, who also is very skillful in working with conservative forces, interesting mix. But I do think it's reached a sort of critical point to re-understand itself and its relevance. And I always think that I do feel, having lived as a monastic for many years, it has profound importance, and I would hate to see that form go. It's a very profound form to practice within. It allows for a lot of depth when it's done well, and it allows to continue the teaching and the tradition in a fairly sort of pure way outside of the marketplace. Ideally, that doesn't always happen, but ideally that is more potential often in that form. I think within your question, and I'll just be brief here because I know we have to. I'm writing to this actually in a book that's coming out in August called "Time to Stand Up," and it's actually It's actually about the importance of the feminine in Buddhist structures, because it's a highly patriarchal, hierarchical form. And I think on all levels, connecting with what we're talking about tonight, there has to be there has to be some sort of welcoming and opening into and all that's implied in that, and and that also includes the promotion and the support of women monastics, which has been a very difficult subject and a very difficult area for a few thousand years of rendering nuns illegal, actually, or not giving them full support, and I think there has to be a real challenge to that. So my journey's been a lot about that for many years too. Mm.